Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to today's SCMA virtual event, How to Negotiate, Find Out Why Without Asking Why, presented by Sydney Kanazawa. My name is Bouvier Yulin, and I'm the director for SCMA. As you can tell, this event is in meeting format, so we ask that you please stay muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions for Sid during the presentation, feel free to put your question in the chat and we'll do our best to get to it. This event is also being recorded, so you'll receive a link to the recording along with the handouts from the presentation no later than Friday next week. If you have any questions regarding the event, please feel free to send me a chat or send me an email at info@scmediation.org. At this time, I'd now like to introduce our event sponsor, Adina Thavongsa from ARC.
Thank you, Bouvier. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. Again, my name is Adina. I handle case management and business development here at ARC. We are one of California's first and longest standing private dispute resolution providers. ARC's impressive panel of jurists includes some of the region's most sought after retired state and federal court judges, as well as attorney neutrals with years of subject matter expertise. ARC handles complex disputes of all kinds. Our specialty panel features only neutrals who have resolved cases in specific practice areas. ARC's reasonable fees give you the most productive use of your litigation budget. Our competitive rates for hearings are fixed and divided amongst the parties, regardless of the value of your case. All jurists set their own hourly rates. We offer services nationally and internationally. Our state-of-the-art Los Angeles facilities, including our Century City location and our downtown offices, are convenient and conducive to resolution. ARC continues to be a leading force in shaping dispute resolution, including being at the forefront of virtual hearings since the beginning of the pandemic. Today, you will hear from ARC neutral Sydney Kanazawa on how to negotiate. Find out why without asking why. Sydney Kanazawa is a mediator, arbitrator, trial lawyer, and bridge builder, bringing people together even when it seems impossible. For over 40 years, he's represented plaintiffs and defendants locally, nationally, and internationally in jury and non-jury trials, arbitrations, administrative proceedings, crises, mediations, and negotiations. Sid builds bridges to take parties from anger and distrust to curiosity and hope. In the largest oil spill in the Port of Los Angeles, Sid quelled an angry mob and settled 600 claims within 2 weeks of the spill and all 2,000 plus within 3 months. Mr. Kanazawa specializes in matters involving admiralty, antitrust, business, contract, class action, construction defect, education, employment, entertainment, environmental, and more. With that, I ask that you give your full attention to Mr. Kanazawa and help me in welcoming him to today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Bouvier, and thank you, Adina, for the very kind arrangement of this program as well as the introduction. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint slide, so my picture is going to be a little bit reduced here. Months ago, I taught a negotiation class at Columbia University. And one of the students asked a question that I thought really encapsulated all the problems that we have with negotiation. The student asked, how do you get the other side to compromise? And I realized when they asked the question that that was the essence of the problem. In our traditional approach to negotiation, we think of negotiations from our perspective. And how do we get the other side to meet us halfway or to come and agree with us? But basically expecting the other side to come to us. It's sort of a bullying approach to negotiation where we bring to the table arguments, power, leverage, threats in order to scare the other side or to persuade the other side to come to our side. And we see it everywhere. We see it in our politics. We see it in everyday negotiations that people use the idea of power and forcing people to agree as the primary mode of negotiation. And the thinking behind it essentially is that if we show enough firepower and we make enough threats and we scare the other side, that they will simply submit. They will give up and they will say, it's all yours, or I'll dismiss the case, or whatever money you want, I'll give you that money. That's the underlying theory and thinking behind this approach. So let me ask all of you, and I can't see all of you right now, so I just have to kind of, assume what your response is, and especially all of you that have been in difficult negotiations, either in mediation or as in person. How many of you have been approached by the other side giving this marvelous argument about why you should succumb to them? And how many of you have basically said, okay, I give up, you're right, take everything, or I'll dismiss the case, it's over, I doubt that very many of you have had that experience where this ferocious presentation by one side resulted in the other side simply giving up and declaring a surrender. Psychologically, most people have three reactions. It's a fight, flight, or freeze. And when they're presented with a threat, they respond in one of those three reactions. They either run away, they freeze, or they fight. And for most of us that are in negotiations, we don't run away, we don't freeze, we fight. And so as a result, this approach results usually in a lot of conflict and a lot of fighting back and forth. And I know people will say, well, it works. We threaten and eventually they surrender and they give up. And one of the perfect examples is World War II. In World War II, we dropped a bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the Japanese surrendered. But I think that if you think about it a little further, we as a country have the biggest nuclear arsenal. But if we bomb somebody and used our nuclear arsenal on somebody, think about what the blowback would be from using the power that we have. In addition, if you think about it, the costs of World War II were incredible. The transactional costs, 85 million people were killed. 33% of the world was killed. Russia suffered 27 million deaths. China suffered 20 million deaths. And the incredible part is the side that won, the Allied forces, lost 85% of those deaths. And the Axis forces that they defeated lost 15%. And after the war, it's even more interesting that the countries that were our opposition, Japan, Italy, and Germany, are now our closest allies. And our allies, China and Russia, are now our enemies. And I would submit to you that the reasons for all of this have less to do with the assertion of power as opposed to the use of kindness, empathy, and compassion. The Marshall Plan built up Japan, Italy, Germany, and Europe to recreate a new world, a world where we would consider each other allies as opposed to enemies. And I think that has more to do with what has happened since World War II. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to, rather than think about things in terms of power, to think about things in terms of interests. Not the positions that the parties take, but the interests. Why are they wanting to negotiate? Why are they wanting to reach an agreement? What are the stories in their head that they're telling themselves that tells them not to agree to certain terms and to agree to other terms? When you approach things by thinking about the interests of the party, you necessarily ask two questions. Why? Why are the parties wanting to have an agreement in the first place? And once we understand the why, how do we get those competing stories or interests to be aligned so that we can have agreement? Now, the classic description of why is the question of how do you split a lemon or an orange? And the classic story is a mother is faced with two children and they're arguing about who gets this lemon, and they're going back and forth, and both of them want 100% of the lemon. And a mother comes in and sees them squabbling, and so she takes out a knife and she cuts the lemon in half and gives both of them half of the lemon. And both children start crying, and they said, "This is not satisfactory, and this is not going to do for our purposes." And the mother says, "Why?" She asks, "Why? Why is it that cutting the lemon in half and giving each of you 50% so that both of you have exactly what the other has? Why isn't that sufficient and fair to both of you?" And the reason is because they wanted different things. One wanted to make lemonade and only wanted the pulp. The other wanted to make a lemon meringue pie and only wanted the outside zest, the outside skin of the lemon. And so they could have had 100% of what they wanted if somebody had just asked why. Why do you want this whole lemon? And they could have figured out that one wants the inside and one wants the outside, and both could have had 100% of what they both wanted. In order to figure out this why, you have to figure out what's the alternative. You have to look forward as to what would be the alternative if we don't reach an agreement. And the Harvard Program on Negotiation developed this concept of BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And basically, you think through what's our alternative? What happens if we don't agree? And when you do this analysis, you have to do the analysis for both sides. What is the BATNA for yourself, and what is the BATNA for the other side? Why are they engaged in this particular attempt to reach an agreement? After you figure out these interests, you have to then think about how are you going to match these interests together in order to reach an agreement. And again, the Harvard Program of Negotiation uses this concept of a zone of potential agreement. Zone of potential agreement, or ZOPA, is the concept that if there is an overlap between the reservation points, the extent to which one side will negotiate or one side will agree. It's called reservation point or reservation price. And for in simple terms of plaintiff defense, for the defense, how high they will go in terms of settling the case, and for the plaintiff, how low they will go to settle the case. And when there is an overlap between the reservations point for each side, then we call that area where there's an overlap the zone of potential agreement. Now, you can also have no opportunity for potential agreement, and that's when there is no overlap between the 2 points, reservation points. But really, the idea of shaping the ZOPA, shaping that area of zone of potential agreement, is based on us discussing why each side wants this particular agreement. And it involves understanding the stories that are going on in each side's head as to why they want this particular number or this particular agreement. It also involves thinking through the value of giving up certain things versus taking credit for certain things, and being creative about the solutions to appeal to the other's reasons for wanting to enter into an agreement. And so when you're trying to put together different parties' interests and trying to figure out how to align those interests in a way that will be within that zone of potential agreement, it's much easier to look at the problem from the perspective of the other side first. In other words, you know what you want, but it's much easier when you get into the negotiations to look at the problem from the other side's perspective and try to figure out how you can solve the other side's problem. In other words, rather than expecting the other side to come to you, you go to the other side and try to understand the perspective of the other side, why they want what they want, what is driving them, their motivations, and try to see from their perspective, what is it that I can offer that can solve the other side's problems. So how do you do this? First, you need to ask a lot of questions. And last year, Alexander Carter, Columbia University professor, law professor, wrote a book called Ask for More, 10 Questions for Any Negotiation, something like that. Basically, what she says is, in essence of what she says, is that she focuses on open-ended questions. And what she points out is that if you don't ask open-ended questions, you are really asking about what you are interested as opposed to what the other person is interested in. And she gives the example in her book about asking someone about their trip abroad. And this is, before our COVID-19 situation that she started writing this book. So in that context, she asks, when you ask somebody what they did on a trip, you could ask them, where did you land? What was your first location? What did you do the first day? And you can ask all those kinds of questions. But when you ask those questions, you are really asking about what you are curious about, rather than what was of interest to the other side. And so if you instead ask the question, how was your trip? What was it like? Tell me about your trip. And she's big on this idea of tell me about your trip. And by asking that completely wide open question, you give the other side an opportunity to tell you what is of interest, what is of importance to them. And you have to listen very carefully to both what they say and what they don't say to get an idea of where their head is at in this particular negotiation. Second thing, as I said, is you got to listen. What was said and what wasn't said very, very carefully. And in the process of just simply listening real carefully to the other person, there's an amazing thing that happens. You are showing respect. And by showing respect, you start to build trust. And trust is the essence of what we need in order to try to negotiate an agreement. There's another author out there that's very popular, Chris Voss. He wrote a book called Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It. He was a FBI hostage negotiator, and the title is kind of trying to capture the idea that when you're in hostage negotiations, you can't split the difference. You can't take that lemon and cut it in half and give both sides 50-50 and say, okay, give me 2 of the hostages and you can keep the other 2 and we're done, we're good. You can't do that when you're doing hostage negotiations. You have to try to get the whole thing. But in order to get the whole thing, you have to understand the thinking of the hostage taker. And again, the way that Chris Voss talks about doing that is that you have to ask a lot of questions. You have to try to identify with the hostage taker, not agree with them, but show that you can understand their perspective, that you can see their perspective. And for Chris, the thing that he is looking for is for the hostage taker to say, that's right. Not you're right. You're right means go away, I don't want to talk to you anymore. But when the hostage taker says, that's right, then you know that you are in the ballpark of seeing the world the way they're seeing. And the reason that this becomes very, very important is because the hostage taker whom you're trying to persuade is not going to hear you, not going to listen to you unless you can show that you can identify with them and that you can see the world as they see the world. So my epiphany in all this was, as Adina talked about at the very beginning, this oil spill in the Port of Los Angeles. It was the largest oil spill ever in the Port of Los Angeles. We contaminated 7 miles of shoreline. 2,000 claims would arise from this oil spill. The harbor would be shut down for 5 days. This is one of the busiest harbors in the world. And we, because of the oil spill, we shut down the port for 5 days, and then we would clean up for the next 3 months. But you can imagine how mad everybody was when all of a sudden the busiest port, one of the busiest ports in the world, was shut down for 5 days. All of a sudden, it was like COVID-19. All of a sudden, everything shut, and everything came to a standstill in the port. Well, what happened was about 2 days after the spill, I put together a team, and we put together a claims office, and we got a claims manager, and we had a meeting on the dock where we were explaining how we're going to process all of these claims. And my claims manager got up and he started to talk and explain how he was going to process all of these claims. And everybody started shouting him down. They were angry. And so they said, "You guys are so stupid. You should have done a better job in this oil spill or not spilled the oil in the first place and all that." And it just yelled him and didn't allow him to talk. And so I stepped up to the podium. And the next guy that yelled at me, I asked him, "What do you think we should be doing now that we're not doing already?" And he said something about communication. And behind me, we had this big whiteboard that we were using for cleanup operations. And one of my guys happened to be standing there with a pen. And he wrote down what that guy said. And the next guy yelled at me, and I said, "What do you think we should be doing now that we're not doing already?" And he said something that was relevant, and we wrote that down. And pretty soon we filled up the entire board with what people told me after they stopped yelling at me, what we should be doing. Right? Interestingly, we didn't plan any of this. This was just happenstance. We happened to have that board. I happened to ask that question. There was no pre-planning about this whole thing. It just happened. And then this guy, after we filled up the entire whiteboard, and by the way, we didn't necessarily agree with everything that they said, but we just accepted and write down everything that they said. This guy in the back of the crowd stood up. And he, from the way in the back of the crowd, he stood up and he said, "We don't give a damn about any of this. Where's my money?" And this woman in the front row that was organizing and collecting contact information from everybody who was there to bring a mass lawsuit against my client, a foreign ship owner. This lady in the front row stood up. She turned to the back of the crowd and she said, "Sit down and shut up. These guys are trying to help." And that group of people that were organizing against us became our liaisons. And that's how we settled 600 of the claims within 2 weeks of the spill, and all 2,000 within 3 months of the spill. This angry sea of people that were against us all of a sudden turned into an ocean of collaborators. That was my epiphany, that things can change and can change dramatically if you bring the right attitude and ask the right questions in the process. I think the theory is based on Aristotle's theory of persuasion. That Aristotle said that there's 3 aspects to persuasive speech, rhetoric. ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is the credibility and believability of the speaker. Pathos is the emotional or moral justification for following the speaker's lead. And logos is the logic. And this is what Aristotle said, that you have to present your arguments, your presentations, in that order: ethos, pathos, and logos. Right? Ethos is the speaker has to be someone that people want to listen to, want to believe. And so if the speaker is somebody that no one trusts and no one wants to listen to, it doesn't matter what that speaker says, because nobody is listening if they are not someone that they can identify with, that they can trust, that they can believe in. And all that. So ethos is the most important aspect of persuasion. You got to be heard before you can persuade anybody. Pathos, that moral, emotional justification for following the speaker's lead, that comes next. Because if I feel that the speaker is right, then I will follow that speaker's lead, and logic, logos, fills in the blanks. Aristotle said logos, logic, does not persuade. That logos just fills in the justification for following the speaker's lead. Believing in the speaker, feeling the speaker is correct. And logos just kind of fills in the blanks, gives us a reason to go ahead with it. But logos, the logic, does not in itself persuade. And here's the irony. For all of you that are lawyers, when we go to law school and learn to think like a lawyer, we're taught just the opposite. We're taught that logic is most important, that emotions shouldn't matter, and that all people are created equal. And so the speaker, it doesn't matter. The credibility of the speaker doesn't matter. And all that. And as a result, you can see why our traditional approach at negotiation may be the way that we think is right, because we come from a Judeo-Christian tradition in our legal system that comes with a philosophy that there is one truth. There's one God, one way, and one truth. And our whole system is designed with the concept that somehow we're going to get to that one truth. But the reality is we settle 98% of the cases, and we try only 2% of the cases. And so 98% of the cases, we don't get one truth. And even in the 2% that goes to trial, some products are defective in one trial and not defective in another trial, the exact same product. And so even when that 2% goes to trial and the attorneys seek to get the agreement of the judge or the jury with their position, they don't necessarily get a consistent one truth agreement. In fact, we convict people. The Innocence Project has shown us that we've convicted people, who were put in jail beyond a reasonable doubt that did not do the crime. And so the idea that we can use power to try to persuade our way into getting an agreement comes from a lot of the myths that we hold as to how to persuade, what kind of system we have. Now, as I was talking about earlier, probably the most important aspect of negotiation is the person. Is just like that Aristotle said, it's that ethos. And in fact, Robert Cialdini, who is a more recent thinker in this area of persuasion, and he wrote this book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. The way he went about it is he went all over the country, and he was basically trying to figure out how is it that these salesmen are so effective in selling their products and the like. And he found that the way in which they sell their products, he followed them, the best salesmen around, and he tried to find out what is it that they do to sell. And he came up with 6 principles as to how you persuade. And one of the most important was people like those who like them. That we buy from someone who I can identify with, that we like. And liking people is probably the most important thing that influences people or persuades people to a particular position. If we don't like you, we're not going to listen to you. But if we like you, you got a chance at persuading us to follow your lead. And so, just as Aristotle talked about ethos and pathos, the credibility and believability of witness and identifying with the emotional and moral justification of the plaintiff's lead, Cialdini found the same thing with respect to the salespeople that he followed around. Now, if you ever get the chance, listen to Robert Kennedy's speech when he announced the assassination of Martin Luther King in Indianapolis, Indiana. This is probably one of the most incredible impromptu speeches of all time. Robert Kennedy landed in Indianapolis and was campaigning for president. And he was supposed to go to a campaign rally in a black neighborhood. And all of his advisors and the police and everybody else told him, don't go. Because Martin Luther King had just been shot when he had landed in Indianapolis. And Robert Kennedy realized something that I don't think anybody else realized, that he was the only person in the country that should go to this black neighborhood and speak to the people that were gathered there for his presidential rally. He goes to this rally and he stands on the back of a flatbed truck and he delivers a speech about compassion and love. But the most important thing that he says is that I understand that you can be angry and want revenge because Martin Luther King was killed by a white man. But he says, I understand that you could hate and our country can be divided. And I understand that because my brother was also killed by a white man. And that identification allowed him to calm the crowd. And they all went home. And there was never any rioting in Indianapolis as a result of that speech. It is remarkable, and I commend you to listen to it. It is really a remarkable speech. Martin Luther King brought thousands to Washington in this when he delivered his I Have a Dream speech. They didn't come because somebody forced them to be there. They came because they wanted to be there, because they identified with Martin Luther King. They believed him, they found him credible, and they felt that he was right. Ethos and pathos. Now, all of us were given a choice last year. All of us were given a choice as to who we identified with. And the Black Lives Matter movement wasn't just the largest protest movement in the United States. It was the largest protest movement in the world. And that video of the police officer on top of George Floyd for 9 minutes gave us a picture that forced us to decide, who do we identify with? And the size of the movement is a reflection of who we identified with. Not with the person that had power, but we identified with the person that did not have power and died in this particular incident. So it's not about power, it's about who you identify with. The other aspect about persuasion is that people are reciprocal, and Cialdini noted this, that people, react to other people as they are being treated. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And what that phrase means, and is in practically all the religions, is that our instinctual reaction is to react in the same manner as the other side acted upon us. And so the idea of revenge and hitting back and doing everything an eye for an eye, all of those concepts are our natural reaction to what somebody does to us. But this philosophy of saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, recognizes that we can break that cycle. That we can break that cycle by taking a different tack, by choosing to react differently than our normal instincts would cause us to react. And so in negotiations, you see somebody make an extremely high demand, the other side makes an extremely low demand, and it goes like that most of the time, all right? That's our natural reaction. But you can choose to do something differently. And it's that difference that makes changes the whole dynamic of the relationship. Jerry Buss is a good example. In his lifetime, and you know how hard it is to win one championship. While he owned the Lakers, they had 10 championships. And with different teams, different players. And you wonder, how did he do that? How did he put together teams that won the championship 10 times during his lifetime? And we got some insight into that when he died, because his business partner spoke at his funeral and talked about how Jerry Buss does business. And Jerry Buss, when he does business, he looks at the deal from all sides. And if it looks fair from all sides, then he'll do the deal. If it doesn't look fair to all sides, he won't do the deal. And his business partner talked about how one time he agreed to do the deal, and after the fact, he thought, I don't think that's particularly fair. So he threw in a couple of extra players just to make it fair. Now think about how you would feel negotiating with Jerry Buss as opposed to somebody who thought that negotiations is about winning and losing, that I have to take as much as I can, otherwise I'm losing. And the feeling that people would have in terms of opening up and collaborating with Jerry Buss. Think also about the players, that once they're in the Laker organization, how much are they going to commit and be all in? How much are they going to defend themselves and worry about being taken by Jerry Buss, as opposed to opening up and giving all of themselves for the organization? That level of trust that he engenders is in large part because of how he treats other people and how he creates a cycle of feeling as to how doing business with Jerry Buss, his perspective on doing business. In Charleston, South Carolina, we had an incident where a person that was enamored with the Confederate flags and with guns went to a AME church, a black church in Charleston, and sat in a Bible study class for an hour, and then took out a gun and killed 9 of the parishioners in an effort to start a race war. And he was captured shortly thereafter, and a bond hearing was initiated a few days later. And at the bond hearing, the family members appeared, and incredibly, they said, "We forgive you. We forgive you, and we give our compassion to your family." And that act of grace took the Confederate flag down from the capital of South Carolina a couple weeks later. That flag, and whether to take it down or not, had been a controversy that had been going on for years and remained on top of the Capitol buildings until this happened. And the grace of this family shamed everyone into taking down that Confederate flag and showing the respect that the family showed to everyone else. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison by the apartheid government. He had every reason to be hateful and seek revenge. But instead, he saw his guards as being as entrapped as he was, and he showed compassion to them and empathy. And eventually, they gave back that empathy and compassion, and they passed it along all up and down the chain. And by the time the transition of South Africa took place, the South African apartheid government was negotiating with their own prisoner to effectuate this transition. It wasn't the powerful that initiated the negotiation. It was the powerless that used compassion and an appreciation of how you can connect with empathy as opposed to showing power and force. Our problem in every negotiation is getting out of our glass bubble and connecting with the other side. And in order to do that, you have to understand the other side, and you have to see the perspective of the other side to be able to connect. When we negotiate across the table and we think that it is a war and that we are warriors on behalf of our side, warriors are the last people in the world that you would trust. You would never trust the warrior on the other side. You would never trust even the athlete on the other side to come to your side and say, hey, you should run this play. It's a good play against us. You wouldn't trust them to do that. It is because the perception that you have is that they are going to take whatever they can take. And it's not conducive to reaching an agreement. By contrast, if you think of it as we're all on the same side of the table, and we're going to throw the problems and all of the people on the other side of the table, and we're going to work together on the same side of the table to solve the problems on the other side of the table, it changes your whole dynamic. And for me, when I'm mediating, I listen to myself and see how much am I saying we as opposed to you or me or them or anything like that. The more I'm saying we, the more I think that I am thinking in terms of this collaboration as opposed to, thinking about a win-lose type of situation or being opposing as a warrior. So how do you do this? Again, we've talked a lot about the interests and understanding the perspective of the other side. But it's not just getting common ground. Even when you don't have common ground and you have different perspectives, just as in the lemon situation, the fact that people want different things is not a reason that you cannot have an agreement. If you understand the interests, sometimes what one side wants and thinks is very valuable, the other side thinks is not that valuable, and they're more than willing to give it up. And so the more pieces that you have on the table, the more opportunities there are to find a way of blending those interests in a fashion that allows for an agreement as opposed to the alternatives. A key to this process is to listen, to really listen. Listen to that first reaction. Listen to what is being said and what is not being said. Listen to the body language. Listen to the facial expressions. And basically try to identify what it is that is motivating the other side. And sometimes you have to put in a lot of tests and alternatives to figure out what is important, what is not important. And on the other side, you have to clearly message to the other side what you are thinking and what you are feeling about this process. In the process, you're building a relationship. You're building the trust that's needed to reach an agreement. And if you're thinking interactively, not just what I want, this is me speaking, but if you think in terms of how will what I say or what I do affect the other side. In other words, seeing it from the other side's perspective, you're more likely to reach an agreement. You got to suspend your judgment about the situation, because oftentimes the interests or the stories that each side is telling are incompatible. There isn't one truth. You can't make it into a common truth, but you can still reach an agreement. You can still reach an agreement with each side believing whatever they want to believe, or justifying their situation for different reasons, and still have an agreement. And you can create value. One of the things about negotiations is that it works a lot better when you respect the other side. And it works a lot better when you respect the other side because it allows you to help the other side write their victory story. What are they going to tell their clients, their colleagues, their friends and family about why they entered into this agreement? The more you can think in their terms as to what they're going to say to write their victory story, the more you have a chance of fitting your interests in with their interests. I tell people in negotiations all the time that whatever happened, happened. Whether it was good or bad or something that shouldn't have happened, it's done. We can't change it. What we can change is today and tomorrow. That's really all we can change is today and tomorrow. And so if you can keep everybody focused on today and tomorrow, then you have a chance of shaping those interests in a way that will make a difference. You can build on what we have today, which may be from the past. Martin Luther King is a perfect example where he used the documents of our founding as being the basis for arguments that he was making in the present for the future. And in fact, there's a professor here in Southern California by the name of William Crano, who wrote a book called The Rules of Influence, Winning When You're in the Minority. And he makes this point. Again, it's the same point that Aristotle made. Identification. Identification, the ethos and pathos. That basically says, look, every new idea starts with one person. Why do some ideas change the majority and some do not? And he says the reason is if that one person is thought of as an other, as not part of our group, then that person has no chance of persuading the group. But if that one person is identified as part of our group, maybe a black sheep in our group, but is part of our group, then they have a chance of persuading the group to change direction. They have to identify with the group, identify with the values and thinking and history and basic foundations of the group in order to make that change. So finally, why not? Why? I started off this talk talking about why. You need to know why, and the reason you need to know why is because you need to know, whether cutting the lemon in half is going to satisfy everybody. And if you ask the question why, you can find out that you can solve the problem by giving everybody 100% of what they want, if you ask why. So why don't you just ask why? And here's the reason. When I was a trial lawyer, I always asked why in deposition. Why? Because it locked people into their story. It's very difficult to change your story later on after you've said what your motivation was for doing whatever it is that you did. Right? It locks your story. And so for the very same reason that I asked why, so that people's stories don't change at the time of trial, is the reason that you don't ask why in negotiations. Because in negotiations, you want people to be fluid. You want people to move. You want people to think in different perspectives and different look at things differently than how they've been looking at it before. And so one of the things that Cialdini found when he went out and looked at all the salespeople is that we are an animal of consistency. And that when we publicly announce something, we follow through. And the example that he gives in the book is that there was a campaign to wear seatbelts or something like that. And basically, they went to two neighborhoods. And in one neighborhood, they wanted to put up this big billboard that says, wear your seatbelts. And 80% of the people in that neighborhood said, no, I don't want that in my yard. And they went to another neighborhood and they asked the same question, and 70% of the people in that neighborhood said, yes, put that ugly billboard in my yard. And so the question was, why? Why was it that one neighborhood said no, and the other neighborhood said yes? Well, in the neighborhood that said yes, they went a week before, and they asked those homeowners to put a small little sticker that says, wear your seatbelts in their window. Small little sticker. And that small little sticker made people feel that they had to be consistent. That if they believed that you should wear your seatbelts and put up a sticker for, a small sticker in your window, then the big one would be consistent with that position. Therefore, I'll get the other, the big billboard, or even big billboard, even if it's ugly. Cialdini talks about it in terms of how to get people to do something. When we have the get out to vote type of programs, they use this same principle. They ask people on the phone, when are you going to vote? What time are you going to vote? How are you going to get there? Who's going to watch the kids? How long do you think you're going to be there? And they help people articulate and plan out how they're going to vote. And they do that because once they have publicly announced how they're going to vote, they usually follow through because of this principle of consistency. And so in negotiations, when you want people to be flexible and you want people to think differently and to try to think of different ways in which we can work together, you don't want people to be drawing a line in the sand and basically saying, I'm not going to move from here. That I've publicly announced this is the reason that I am taking this position, and I'm not going to back down from that position. So basically, asking why in negotiations creates an unnecessary hurdle that you force people to draw a line in the sand, and that could be very problematic when you're trying to negotiate with them. So we talked about it. It's about respect and empathy and asking why and trying to figure out how you can blend the different stories into a consistent whole. And I think that I can conclude this by just talking a little bit about Lincoln in one of our most divided times. And he too noted that one of the best ways to defeat an enemy is to make him a friend. Not to power over them, to defeat them by overpowering them or making them scared, but by making them a friend, by giving them a safe embrace as being part of the tribe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sid. That was such a fascinating presentation, and I'm sure everybody felt the same way. If anybody has any questions, right now would be the time. I just put it on the chat. If anybody would like to ask anything, or feel free to unmute if you'd like at this moment. It's hard to see everyone.
I'll take this
Let
down.
me see. Sure. Okay. Well, it doesn't seem like anybody has any questions. So I will go ahead and wrap everything up. I would like to say thank you to Sid, of course, for taking the time for such a fantastic presentation. I would like to thank ARC for sponsoring our event and for coming here with us today. And also to all of you for joining us today. So if you have any questions, again, for us, please feel free to send us an email. We will send out a recording next week, along with some handouts that we will include from Sid. And that's it. So thank you so much. I hope everybody has a great weekend.
Bouvier.
Oh,
Bouvier.
hi, Richard.
Hi, yeah,
Hi.
I had my hand up. I was just,
Oh,
I
I'm
was,
sorry. I didn't see that.
I was just late on the draw there, but Sid, I'm Richard Earhart. I'm president-elect of the Southern California Mediation Association. Just wanted to personally thank you for a fascinating presentation, as a matter of fact. And I hope to actually, as things are becoming a little less virtual, hope to meet you in person at some point in the very near future, sir.
Me too. Me too. Looking forward to it.
Yes, well, thank you again for today. This was great.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.